Okay, let's get started. My name is Tansen Sen. I am the director of Center for Global Asia. I'm a professor of history at NYU Shanghai. And a good evening to those of you who are in East Asia or in South Asia. Good afternoon to those of you who are in London. And very good morning to those of you who are in the East Coast. I'll ask my co-panelist, Adhira, to introduce herself now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adhira Mangalagiri. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Comparative Literature at Queen Mary University of London. I work on Chinese and Hindi Urdu literatures of the 20th century. And I'm actually joining you tonight from Shanghai. I'm based this year at the Center for Global Asia with Dissent. And I'm really very much looking forward to the conversation today, not only because Professor Thapar's Gazing Eastwards was such a pleasure to read. For those of you who read it, you would have noticed right away that it's written in such elegant prose, but also because this book really carries a lot of significance for my research. Tansen and I are both, in fact, working on the 1950s, which many of you will remember as the period of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, this moment of heightened interaction and exchange between China and India. And there are in fact several travelogues that we've been looking at of this period written by both Indian and Chinese visitors. So in one sense, Gazing Eastwards is part of this collection of texts that provides us with an account of interactions between China and India during the 50s. But what I found really interesting was there's so many ways in which this particular book stands apart from that collection of travelogues and really offers a unique perspective on such a wide range of issues. So I'm really looking forward during the conversation today to really probing and getting into what it is that makes this book so unique and valuable.
Right, as part of our studies of China and India, as Adhira mentioned, I am personally working on Nehru's relations with China from 1947 onwards. And this event today is part of what we have started in collaboration with the India-China Institute at the New School and the LKY School of Public Policy at NUS, something called China-India Dialogue Series. And this is the first one and which we are launching. The idea is to talk not about IR or border issues, but to look at people and organizations that have been neglected in the study of China-India connections. And that is why I think our eminent guest today is quite important. We hope to have this kind of a China-India dialogue once or twice every semester with the LKY School and the India-China Institute at the New School. So this is the first one of that series. This event is also a kickoff to a celebration of the 10th anniversary of NYU Shanghai. The kickoff has just started. The 10th year anniversary will take place in October next year. And the person responsible who founded this institution and made it a success is our provost, Joanna Whaley-Cohen. She is an eminent historian of China. She has really changed the field of Qing history with her books, articles, and book reviews. So I would like Professor Joanna Whaley-Cohen to introduce our eminent guest before we get into the details about the event today. So Joanna.
Thank you very much, Tansen, for that very exaggerated introduction. It is a very particular pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Romila Thapar to NYU Shanghai and the Center for Global Asia, albeit remotely. It's no exaggeration to say that Professor Thapar is one of the world's most distinguished living historians. And indeed, one can hardly begin to describe her impressive oeuvre without becoming hopelessly guilty of understatement. Let me, all the same, begin by speaking of some of her concrete lifetime achievements, and this could take the entire session, but I'll try not to do that. She is the author of now, I think, more than 30 books on the history of India primarily, but not exclusively, its early history from ancient times to the 16th century, to which she has brought a deeply researched and highly nuanced analysis, addressing such topics among many others as the interplay of different belief systems, social development, the function of military power, and state formation. She has that special skill of writing both focused history and general histories, a skill that by no means every historian is capable of, and let alone successful as Professor Thapar is. She is the recipient of honorary doctorates from, among other venerable institutions, Oxford University, the University of Edinburgh in the UK, the University of Chicago in the US, the Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales in France, and the Universities of Calcutta and Hyderabad in India. She has also been awarded many honorary fellowships around the world, including in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and at least one college, but I think 2 at Oxford, as well as many more. In 2008, she shared the enormously prestigious Kluge Prize, which is a kind of Nobel for scholars of the humanities and social sciences awarded by the US Library of Congress. Not counting the book she's going to be talking about today, her most recent book, published last year, is entitled Voices of Dissent, Tracing the History and Evolution of Dissent in the Indian Subcontinent. This choice of topic was no coincidence. In recent years, Professor Thapar's scholarly reputation has come under attack somewhat, as indeed she herself has personally, because of her staunch refusal to revise her interpretation of the past to better conform to a more politicized view of history promoted by certain quarters in India, which has been, in the same way has been the case in other parts of the world, has sometimes launched attacks against any evidence-based scholarship that contradicts their preferred but unfounded version of events. She was simply not willing to say that black was white, or to elevate or demonize the role of certain groups in the past to suit the political winds. Her immense standing and the support she garnered from eminent scholars around the world who sprang to her defense is such that I think we can safely say we do not expect any compromise in her ethical position anytime soon. The topic of her talk today is her most recent book, Gazing Eastwards, of Buddhist Monks and Revolutionaries in China, 1957, in which she recounts her experiences and observations on an archaeological trip of which we can stand in awe, and I might say a little envy, to the great Buddhist sites of Maijishan and Dunhuang. I highly recommend it. It gives a taste of how she thinks, how she has her opinions, but keeps an open mind, offering neither adulation, except possibly about her first encounter with Peking duck, nor condemnation. How she is fearless in pursuit of knowledge, including clambering up sheer rock faces with 100-meter drops to get into the caves where she was to work, yet human enough to really miss a hot bath, and so on. It captures as well a moment in China's history that relatively few outsiders had the opportunity to observe at first hand, in vivid, elegant, and insightful terms. As a historian myself, I would like to say that for many historians of my generation and the following ones, Professor Thapar has been a kind of beacon, upholding the highest and most uncompromising scholarly standards throughout her career, and lighting the way through her scholarship to the pinnacle of the field. She is really a model to us all, and I hope we can be worthy successors to her fantastic example. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Romila Thapar.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I think that was a wonderful introduction, not only to Professor Thapar, but also to the book, which we are going to talk about. So before I start, before Adhira and I start talking to Professor Thapar about the book itself, I just wanted to point out to the audience that if you have questions, comments, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen and write your questions there. Adhira and I are going to moderate it after about 40 minutes after we go through the question and answers we have after reading her book in detail, not only for our own research purposes, but also fascinated by what she was telling us about the 1950s. So welcome, Professor Thapar. And since most of the people here, there are about 200 people who registered for today's event, there are already 100 who have showed up now. Could you, for the benefit of those who have not read the book, tell us about how the trip came about? I think most of you know as a historian of India, but very few people know about your China connections. And so this book gives a detail about that China connection part of your life. So what was the main purpose of the trip and how your team came about? That would be a good introduction to the book to those who have not read it.
Well, let me begin by saying, first of all, expressing my deepest thanks for this opportunity to be able to talk to all of you and to be able to answer some of these questions. I found the introduction absolutely overwhelming, unbelievable in places. Nevertheless, absolutely delighted to be meeting an audience like yours and meeting those of you that will be asking questions. How did this all come about? It was a big surprise in the sense that I was doing my PhD in London, working at the School of Oriental and African Studies on Ashoka Maurya. I was struck by the fact when I first arrived in London at SOAS that we in India know so little about China. I mean, for us, and certainly pre-modern China, we had in those days, we had 2 or 3 scholars who wrote on the subject. Now we have hardly those, maybe a couple at the most. But it was not something that was really in our vision. Our vision was very much westwards, and through the colonial period, of course, very much geared to Britain and Europe. So China came as a kind of very pleasant surprise. I mean, what is this vast culture doing next door to ours about which I don't really know very much and which I should really get to know? And so someone said, you know, there's a person who's giving a course on Chinese art and archaeology, and you don't have to take it for an exam, just sit in and listen to it. So that's what I did in my first year, not knowing and not believing for a moment that I would ever have a chance to go to China. And then 3 years down the line, 4 years down the line, when I was in the middle of writing my thesis, I got a call from someone whom I knew very slightly. This was Anil De Silva, who was a Sri Lankan art historian, had worked in Sri Lanka, had worked in Bombay for a bit, and she knew my brother and sister-in-law and so on. And then she moved to Paris and she was working there on Buddhist art. And on a couple of occasions, she'd written to me from Paris and wanted some references, which I had looked up and given her, or she wanted some information. That was all. And then suddenly one evening, I get this telephone call from her from Paris saying, would you like to go to China for 3 months? And I said, Anil, what are you serious, or what is this in aid of? And she said, no, I had put in for an invitation to do a study of 2 sites, 2 Buddhist cave sites. One is relatively unknown, Meiji-san. The other is very well known. And my intention is, first of all, to look at the unknown site and gather a little material and write it up in a way that it gets to be known. And the other site, which is relatively well known, I want to work specifically on landscape painting as it is depicted in the murals. And so I said, well, what do I do in all of this? Because I know nothing about China. And she said, no, I just want you to come as my research assistant because I've been given this invitation, which was actually, which can linked up to her conversations with Ambassador K.M. Panikkar, who was then the Indian ambassador in Paris, who wrote a very striking book around that time, Asia and Western Dominance, which was a kind of departure from the usual kind of things. Panikkar was a great friend of Zhou Enlai's. So when Anil spoke to him and said she would like to go and do a little bit of research there and produce these books so that people would know something about unknown sites and known sites, he spoke to Zhou Enlai, and the China Friendship Association agreed to give us a grant. So that was how it all started. And they gave us a grant for Anil, for a research assistant, for a photographer, and said, we will provide you with an interpreter. And you work out your itinerary and tell us where you want to go and what the purpose is of your visit. So I said to her, you know, I'm in the middle of my thesis and my supervisor may take it very badly if I turn up tomorrow morning and say I'm off to China for 3 months. So she said, well, find out and let me know. And my supervisor was Professor Basham. So I walked into his office the next morning and he said, why are you looking so depressed? So I said, I got this tremendous invitation. I don't know what to do. Should I drop my thesis and go, or should I say no? And he said, you know, yeah, that's absurd. Of course you must drop your thesis and go. Just leave it aside for 3 months. So I rushed out of his office and I rushed into the nearest telephone booth to ring Anil and say, yes, yes, I'm coming, just in case, you know, I changed my mind before the evening was out. So that's how it all began. And then she wrote to me and said, these are the things we want to work on. And I started doing a bit of reading, background reading and so on. And my little registering for this course that 2 years previously came in quite useful, because I remembered some of what I picked up there. And that was it. And so we set off in the month of July.
And what's really interesting about reading the book is that you really get to hear your voice, because it's a diary that you kept during the 3 months that you were in China.
Right.
You say in the preface that you published it with very minimal editing after the fact. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about what it was like to keep the diary as things were going along? How did that help you register what you were experiencing? And then also something that you said a couple of days ago when we were chatting was that you never meant for this to be read by everyone. It was just a diary that you were keeping.
Precisely.
So what has it been like for it to now enter into the world?
No, I intended it. It began as a diary for the simple reason that my friends in Delhi and London all said, oh, this is tremendously exciting. You must write every day and you must write us lengthy letters. And I said, you must be mad if you think I'm going to spend my time writing letters to all 4 or 5 of you, as it were. So then I thought about it and I thought, why don't I just keep a diary? And at the end of the fortnight, I will Xerox the pages and send them to one friend and say, because of course there was no internet in those days and you couldn't send emails or anything. It was all by post. And I will ask that friend to kindly Xerox it again and send it to the others. So the diary was really meant to be a kind of reasonably day-by-day account of what was going on and what was happening and what my thoughts were on the subject and so on. Absolutely no intention of publication. And even when I came back and cleaned it up, it was in a bad shape because I was writing on rice paper, because that was about the best paper you could get in China in those days. And bad ballpoint pens and rice paper meant very smudgy writing. But anyway, there it was. And then people, my friends, my close friends read it and commented on it and so on and so forth. And I put it aside with my papers and really forgot about it. And then 2-3 years ago, when I was clearing out this large bundle of boxes of papers, I suddenly came across this manuscript and I looked at it and I thought, gosh, it's quite interesting in passages. And then a couple of my more recent friends said, oh, we'd love to look at it. And so I gave it to them to look at. And they were the ones who said, no, you really must publish this because it's a moment in time. It's not, it's not an analysis of China, and it's not anything profound in terms of Chinese history and so on. It is simply trying to capture one moment in time in a place where you're not very familiar with the place, you're asking questions and you're making observations. And they said this would be really quite interesting as a comment on a visit that you made. So then when I started looking at it, there were little bits here and there, which I thought, these are abbreviated and nobody will understand what I'm talking about. So I sort of, shook them out a little more and so on, but nothing substantial. There's only the one chapter on the history of Central Asian trade, which I thought I should put in because people who are unfamiliar wouldn't know what we were talking about when we were talking about Majisan and Dunhuang and the contacts with Central Asia and India. So I put that in as a kind of background, a context to why we were visiting these sites. But that was the only contribution, the modern contribution. And the epilogue, of course, 5 pages at the end.
Yeah, no, but for those of us who are doing research on the 1950s, this is a really valuable source for us because we have been looking at travelogues, and there are very few written by Indian women traveling to China. And you are one of the very few who talks about visiting China in the 1950s. But what really stood out is the sound and views that you describe in your book, traveling from London to Prague and from Prague to Beijing, and some of the major cities like Xi'an, Lanzhou, Shanghai, but also small towns where Maichishan and Dunhuang are located. One of the fabulous aspects of that travelogue is traveling on the train, also trucks, and the train where you listen to Western music. So looking back at that experience of the sounds and views of large cities, small towns, places where you lived in Maichishan, this Buddhist monastery, what still stands out in your memory about China in the 1950s?
Lots of things. It's hard to specify what stands out. Remember that the mid-1950s was in many ways an extremely uncertain, exciting, historical period. We were coming out of a situation of colonialism and wanting democratic nation states. All of us were absolutely hung on this business of we had to be democratic. At the same time, it was a period in which there was rampant authoritarianism. Don't forget that this is the period of McCarthyism in America, which was really quite horrific. It is a period of the decline of fascism in Germany and in Italy, but people talking about what authoritarianism did in those areas. And the other very striking event for those people of my age was 1956, when Khrushchev spoke at the Congress, the Communist Party Congress of the USSR, and revealed what Stalinism was all about, what the Stalin administration was about, and the authoritarianism there. And so one was kind of torn between saying, yes, we want a democratic society, we're aiming towards a democratic society, and at the same time, there's all this authoritarianism that has loomed up in the recent past, because for us in the 50s, the 40s was the recent past. And so there was an intense curiosity to see which way is China going to go. It's a post-colonial society, and like all post-colonial societies, it has a commitment to democracy. Will it become a democracy? Or will it, like its Soviet predecessor, go the other way? Is Stalinism going to be what is going to emerge? And there were sort of hints of, is Mao going to become another Stalin and that kind of thing. So in a sense, it was more than just visiting a new country and a new culture. It was also keeping in mind the fact that this was a historical period of the utmost importance to all of us, both to the developed countries and to what in those days was called the Third World. So that kind of thinking was really, really very, very close.
This actually brings up a question that I had while I was reading. You mentioned, 56, Khrushchev's secret speech, and this really important time, which was also a time of intense political campaigns and change in China. 56, there was the 100 Flowers campaign, and then you visited during the anti-rightist campaign, which was a kind of clampdown on the previous 100 Flowers movement. There are little hints where this comes up in your records of your visit. You can see little hints of where people are grappling with the general climate of the anti-rightist moment, and you as a foreigner getting little glimpses into what's happening in terms of rectification and so on. Now, how did what was happening in China at the time, this prior little 100 Flowers glimpse of openness and then a sudden close down, how did that become perceptible to you while you were there?
Well, whilst I was there, I found it very confusing in some ways, because, you know, one assumed that China was going to be very open. All right, not very open. It was going to be open compared to other countries that had gone through a socialist revolution and emerged, but not as openly as one had assumed that they might. So to arrive in Beijing, and after 2 days to say we've drawn up our itinerary and we would like to meet the officers of this, and this department to discuss what we would like to do. And some we met immediately and talked about, and there were others, the more important ones, who were always very busy in committees. And we would say, but you know, we asked for an appointment in the morning and you said no, perhaps in the afternoon. We asked for the afternoon and you said no, we're very busy, perhaps tomorrow. Is there going to be a chance to meet them? Because we have to leave in another 10 days and start our work. And it was then that I began to remember comments that had been made in London by friends about rectification campaigns, and how people were having to go into the office and do a self-analysis and a self-criticism, and how there was going to be there were conversations with other people about what kind of self-analysis one was doing. And I kept sort of sitting there and thinking, my God, that's very much like the Christian confessional, that you walk into the box and there's a priest sitting there and you say, I did such and I did so many wrongs, and now what punishment am I going to get, kind of thing. And I couldn't quite believe that an ongoing system that was so concerned with the future of building a good quality-based society would be so concerned with self-analysis and rectification. So there was always this sort of, you know, toss up between what exactly is going on and why is it happening. And of course, the big difference was, curiously, that was Beijing in July when we got there. When we returned after our trip right round and came back, and the last 2-3 weeks we spent there before leaving, it was much more relaxed, much more relaxed. I mean, people said they would see you, we gave you an appointment, they kept the appointment, and you walked in and there was chat and so on. So something at that point obviously had shifted a little bit, and maybe the rectifications were not so serious or whatever it was that had shifted, but there was a perceptible difference between that early session and the later ones. We weren't told very much about the rectification side of it. We were told about the 100 flowers, and you know, you can ask any questions you like. And one did, one asked a whole heap of questions. And then there was this niggling problem that when you'd ask the fourth person the same question, you got the same answer. And then you began to say, wait a minute, what's going on over here? Are there answers being doled out? And slowly and gradually one understood that one didn't ask direct questions. One asked questions in a very roundabout way if one was trying to get an answer. But even then, it was very difficult to get an absolutely, when I say an absolutely straight answer, I don't mean a dishonest answer, but simply that, you know, a careful answer. You always got a careful answer. It was always studied, weighed, and replied. Your question was replied to with a certain amount of extra thought that you think wasn't really necessary, but they thought was necessary.
I mean, if I could follow up on that, what you talked about was basically interactions with scholars and some officials that you encountered mostly in the large cities. But one of the fascinating aspects is about your experience in small cities, especially at the Buddhist monastery in the Mighty Sun, or when you end up in a clinic. So the interactions there with the common people, the monk with whom you play table tennis with, the interaction with them must be quite different from the people you are meeting at Peking University or other places. Were they also concerned about what's happening in China, or they were just busy with the day-to-day lives?
No, the interaction was very different. You're absolutely right. I mean, we had been given very strict instructions that one section, one wing of the monastery had been cleared for us. It had 2 rooms, so the 4 of us fitted in very neatly, and, you know, we were fed there and kept there. And we were told, you are under no circumstances to go from that wing of the monastery to the rest of the monastery. From that wing of the monastery, you climb up the cliff and you go up to the caves and work there. So. And then this incident with the ping pong started one day when we heard this ping pong going on, you see. And I said to the interpreter, is somebody playing ping pong the other side, table tennis? And she laughed and said, well, you know, the poor monks are sitting here and they sometimes amuse themselves. And I said, oh, how I wish I could play a game too, because, you know, I'm also sitting here. And the next day we got an invitation. And so we went and we had our little game of ping pong, and then the invitations increased and there was more chat, and we often then began to take the evening meal together with the monks and so on. And it was noticeably different in the sense that there wasn't, all right, you're breaking rules. The officials had said no communication, but here there was open communication. You're breaking rules, but it didn't seem to matter at all. Conversations were very much like, you know, one would say, well, you know, when did you become a monk? Where did you come from? You know, which village or city did you belong to, and what made you become a monk, and so on. Very open conversations of that kind. And then we'd have these little evenings of sing-song where we would all be singing songs and whatnot. And one suddenly felt that all of that rectification campaign and what was going on in Beijing was another world. It wasn't the world of these people. And the only time you had that was, you know, sometimes when we were traveling from one place to another, they'd stop and say, this is a model farm, you must see it. So we would go in to see it, you see, and then we would have all these numbers recited about how many tons of wheat is produced, and how many tons of rice, and where it goes, and how many people it feeds, and so on and so forth. But even there, it was a kind of information was doled out with a smile. Information was doled out with, well, if you want to ask questions, you can ask questions. And, you know, we did ask questions and that kind of thing. It was a much more relaxed atmosphere in the smaller towns. And there was, I mean, I felt completely at home in this differentiation, because it was exactly like India in those days, that you went to the villages and your conversations were on entirely different matters from the conversations in Bombay and Delhi and Calcutta and so on. And that difference in the cityscape and the villagescape was really quite clear.
I don't know if Adira wants to ask you about the food you tasted all over the place. I can tell you Adira is very much like you about tasting food, Chinese food. So maybe she has a question about your eating habits in China, because we know some Indians who come to China now find it very difficult to adjust to the Chinese cuisine. So maybe Adira, you want to ask her?
It's not just now. It's, you know, so many of these travelogues written by Indian visitors are just, you know, constant string of complaints about the food. So as soon as I was reading yours, one of my first reactions was to immediately message Thansen and say, oh, thank God she enjoyed the food.
Well, I love Chinese food anyway, and you know what we call Indian Chinese food is very different from Chinese food, because it's much less spice. I suppose it's a bit like the Sichuan food, which is also highly spiced. But fortunately, what we ate in places like Beijing and Mechisan and Dunhuang and so on was a much milder form. But I absolutely loved it, partly because I think I am the kind of person who's always anxious to experiment with food and drink and find out what other people are eating and what they're enjoying and why they're eating what they're eating and so on. This is something that did interest me enormously. So wherever I've been, wherever I've traveled, if I've gone to new places, there's been a tremendous sort of urge to eat what the locals are eating and find out why they're eating what they're eating. It's very, very important. And that, I mean, the greatest joy as far as food was concerned was that the food that you got in the hotels was fairly bland and, you know, the usual kind of thing. But every now and again, practically every week, somebody or the other would say, we must have a banquet for you. And then they would organize a banquet in one of the best restaurants, and the restaurants were really excellent. And you had different kinds of food, you know, Mongolian food and food from the Northeast and food from the South and that kind of thing. And they would take you to a different restaurant each time. And it's true. I mean, the first time when I walked into that famous Peking duck restaurant in Beijing, I mean, my heart was in my mouth in the sense that I just waited anxiously for the food to come. I couldn't believe that I was actually there and going to eat that food. So there was that kind of interest, and also one greatly then looked forward to the statement that perhaps it's time for us to give you a little banquet. And we'd all say, yes, 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 it's time for a little banquet. And that was when we ate the special food.
But you also experienced food poisoning, I guess, that took you to a clinic, and that was a separate experience altogether, experiencing a small hospital, I guess.
That was, yes, in Dunhuang. In Dunhuang, I think I overate in Machisan or something. I must have. So when I arrived in Dunhuang, I had this acute digestive problem and didn't know what to do and could kick myself because instead of being up in the caves, I was so tied to this room and trying to find what medicine. Then they took me to this clinic, yes, and then they gave me some medicine and I was right in a shot and up in the caves again.
No, I wanted to, yeah, go ahead, Arira.
I wanted to ask you about the many archaeological sites that you were taken to or sometimes just happened to go by. And one of the reasons why there were so many archaeological discoveries was because there was so much construction taking place. And so throughout the travelogue, there are these really poignant images of archaeological artifacts emerging from the ground at the very foundations of the new nation's infrastructure, the very foundations of the new roads and the new factories, dams, and so on. And so there's this really interesting combination of past, present, and future all coming together through this act of archaeology. But of course, you in the travelogue, you have kind of mixed feelings about the state of archaeology in China at the time.
Well, I have mixed feelings about the study of archaeology, because I think that again, that was a time when there was a kind of, in archaeological circles elsewhere, and especially in Europe, to some extent in India as well, we'd all been brought up on Gordon Child's archaeology, where, you know, social evolution and the evolution of society from primitive beginnings through more developed phases, ultimately reaching civilization and that kind of thing was considered very important to studying archaeology. Not so much of that existed in China at that time. Their study of archaeology was very much a case of you dig, you discover artifacts, you give the typology of the artifact, and that's it. You don't go on and ask other questions like, you know, if this particular pot was used for, what was this used for? And was it used for ritual? Was it used for just cooking? What was it used for? And if it was used for ritual, why does it have this particular shape? And, you know, the questions that follow from asking the basic questions, as it were. So where we went for them at that time, and at one level, this was really very praiseworthy. They were very, very conscious of being a new nation, but at the same time of being an old nation that was now, as it were, mutating itself into becoming a new nation. Therefore, the great interest that wherever there is digging going on, we have to see what's coming out of the earth. And if there is anything human-made, if there is an artifact, then you note it. You don't necessarily do a scientific excavation, but you note that this level, in this place, this kind of context, this was found. That's all. It's just to give you a little more information. In great contrast, I might say, to my experience here in Delhi, when the metro was being dug in Delhi, and they were digging really deep down in areas that we know were occupied historically. I tried my best to suggest that there was something called rescue archaeology or salvage archaeology, where if there is this kind of deep digging going on, you put an archaeology student in charge and say that if some artifact comes up, which is of significance, please let's do a little more digging in the area. Couldn't get any response. I tried, I mean, the archaeological survey, for example, was particularly uninterested. They kept saying we don't have enough archaeologists. And I said, you don't need archaeologists, you need archaeology students who are, you know, anxious to see what's coming out of the earth. You put them where the digging is going on, and they will spot immediately if there's an artifact and not just a lump of earth. But the Chinese were very conscious of that, you see. And a lot of their museums, for example, have cases where they simply say, construction of such and such a factory or construction of a railway installation in such and such an area in this year. The digging took place in this location and this was found. That's all. You don't have to go into any more details. So that if there's something unique that's found later on, people can come and say, well, should we do another little excavation in that area, or should we dig around? Or it's an indication, it's a hint that there was something. And that impressed me enormously, that the sheer consciousness of linking the past to the present, which of course, unfortunately, was completely overturned with the Cultural Revolution.
Right, but that has revived again, and archaeology as cultural heritage, and the value is now again being emphasized. Not only archaeology on land, underwater archaeology, which as you know is quite expensive, is very, very important to the state these days. And this is a major difference about the value of archaeology that we see in India and in China. They have made archaeology a cornerstone about Chinese identity. And Victor Mayer is here, perhaps he wants to talk about that later on. But the other difference that you point out a number of times in your book, which people like Liu Chunru, your student, and I face when we do pre-modern China-India connection, is the lack of sources from the Indian side, the kinds of travelogues that we find written by Faxian Xuanzang Yijing. We don't find that from the Indian side. And you mentioned that number of times and say, how come we don't have that kind of records about the foreign countries? So do you want to talk about that? That still plays a role in those of us who do pre-modern China-India connections.
Yeah, no, this is something that has troubled me for many, many years now, that, you know, Indians went absolutely everywhere. I can't think of a single place where you haven't had some Indian trader or some Indian sailor or some Indian craftsman who came and settled down and started working and had an impact too. I mean, they're lovely little snippets from Russian sources of Indian merchants living in Moscow, where, you know, a man dies and the Indian community says, yes, his wife has to enter the funeral pyre. And the Russians refuse to give permission to the wife to do that because they think this is absolutely horrendous. And this exchange goes on between the two. And then the Indian merchants say, we will get up and leave. We will boycott Moscow. And that kind of thing. Now, I'm sitting there and saying, surely if this was such a big issue, and there were many others. I mean, this really wasn't a big issue in those terms, in their terms. But whatever it was an issue. Shouldn't there be some record somewhere in Indian sources that we had this altercation and finally, you know, what was the result? I don't know what the result was, but, you know, one would like to have known. There are Indian Buddhist monks, for example, who go to Central Asia, who live there, who marry there and settle down and produce families and so on. You go to Bukhara today, in the center of the city, there's a beautiful construction of houses and homes and so on one side, old ones. And you ask them, what is this area called? And they say, Hinduan Mohalla. The settlement or the area where those from Al-Hind came and stayed. Now, that presence is very big everywhere. And you say, well, did they write about where they went, where they settled, who they met? The monks who are scholars, do they talk about the scholarly discussions that they had with their Chinese counterparts? Do they even talk about the problems of marrying locally and raising a family locally when you're an honest-to-God Buddhist monk, or you're from India and you have strong rituals that you've come with and so on? No. And it puzzles me. I cannot understand why you have this seeming lack of interest in the other. And it's such a contrast. I mean, the moment the China and the India situation opens up in the early centuries AD, you've got heaps of them, Chinese Buddhist monks coming across writing endless little accounts of where they've been, some writing very detailed accounts, as we know, which we use as fundamental source material. But you don't get that counterpart on the Indian side. And I've never been able to explain why. I mean, you had scholarly Indians going to Southeast Asia, for example, where you had an impact of Indian thought, Indian ritual, Indian customs, and so on. But we have no accounts of, you know, I went to Borobudur, or I went somewhere else to Bali, and this is what I saw, and this is what we did, and you know, this was the interest of the local people. There's nothing. And I can't understand it, I must say. I mean, sheer curiosity should lead people to write, to keep diaries.
Yeah. We maybe have time for one last set of questions before we open it up. Speaking of people traveling around East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, I was wondering, especially at the time that you were in China, this early post-colonial moment, that the idea of Asia, which was really coming to the fore at that moment as a post-colonial force. Of course, it was a much older idea, but it gained a new kind of political import during this moment. What did the idea of Asia mean to you at the time? And did it evolve during the course of your trip there?
It was tremendously exciting, I must say. I mean, I don't know if that comes through in the book at all. But this consciousness that the Chinese and the Indians, we're Asians, we're going to show the world. And the consciousness was very great because, you know, we'd been, colonial education meant what? We'd been brought up in all these theories of Oriental despotism and the Asiatic mode of production, and how Asian societies have never had states, they've never had anything democratic, they've never had anything representative, and so on. And this is a completely new thing for them, departure for them. Now, I'm not someone to say that we had democracy and, you know, we were as good as Athens, because I don't believe Athens had a democracy anyway. It was full of slaves. But never mind, that's a little personal perk that I have. But there was that sense, that very strong sense of an Asianism that was now going to assert itself. Post-colonial, we're free, we're independent. We are going to show the world that we're not just the third world in the remote part of the universe. We are something that matters. And I felt it very strongly with when I was in China. And it also produced a strange kind of bonding. One didn't know too much about the Chinese or about Chinese culture. There was a strangeness, there was a foreignness. Yet at the same time, the Asianness was the bonding. And there were some things where, you know, you went somewhere to have a meal with somebody or something, and some question might have come up in your mind about what you should do with your hands, or what you should do, how you should sit, or what you should say or something. And I would immediately think back that, if this was an Indian situation, what would I do? I would do this and I would do it. Like, fully confident that this was a pan-Asian culture that I was being part of. That was very strong at that time, which I never felt on later visits to China. When I went briefly in 1980 and 89, there was a sense of alienation, which I hadn't felt in 57. In 57, there was a great sense of closeness.
And was 89 the last time you visited China?
89 was the last time, yes.
So hopefully, I mean, we have talked in the past about you coming to China, and let's see.
I know, yes, we've often talked about it. I've often thought about it, and somehow it didn't work out. No.
So we'll open the floor for Q&A, and those of you who have questions, I see some questions are already there. If you could type your questions in the Q&A box, but we have already 3 people who perhaps want to question or make comments. So Victor Mayer from University of Pennsylvania, this is where I got in touch with Professor Thapar when I was doing my PhD.
That's right, yes, I remember.
So Victor?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say I've been enjoying this conversation very much, but my internet connection is very unstable. So if I instantly evaporate, you'll know what happened.
Yeah, I'm used to that. I'm very used to that in India.
Okay, be prepared. Here I am, but I may disappear all of a sudden. Okay, so Romila, I remember you fondly from the late 70s and 80s when you used to come to Penn. And I just want to remark that seeing you now on Zoom and listening to you, you haven't changed since those days. That was 70s.
No, don't say that. That was many decades ago.
I remember you fondly from those days. And one thing I wanted to say is that did you actually clamber up the cliff face of Maijishan? Because in those days, the stairs and steps were very rickety. The stairs and the steps of Maijishan would have been very dangerous.
Well, we didn't.
I'm sorry.
Literally.
Did you hear me?
Yes, Victor.
Yes,
I think you are breaking up, so Professor Thapar can answer.
No, but did you go up and look?
I think you asked me whether I actually clambered up the cliffs of Maijishan.
Yeah.
Was that it?
Yeah.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't literally clamber up the rock face because I'm not a rock climber, but we did use the ladders, and they had those little galleries on the slats, which were very dangerous because in case you put your foot on a weak slat, your leg would go right down. And so it was, one walked very gingerly. You felt the floor first, the slat, and made sure it was firm before you put your foot on it. So it was slow moving. But going up was by ladders. We took the ladders up.
Yeah. Okay. So I have one. I hope I can get this question in before I fade away. But that is, you went to Dunhuang in 1957. And you were involved with Anil de Silva, but somebody else from a British art historian named Basil Gray went to Dunhuang in 1957. Were you involved with him at all?
No, not at all. Not at all. No.
Okay. Was he your teacher or something? Did you study with him?
No, I didn't. No. I never really studied with anybody in Chinese studies as such. My work for Anil was all from the point of view of Buddhist art. I was constantly thinking of Ajanta and places like that when I was there and asking the kinds of questions. And it was more sort of measuring and taping and getting photographs from different angles and making notes on what we were doing. But I never studied with Basil.
But Victor, you know that the 2 books that came out of this research trip were published, one on Dunhuang, and Michael Sullivan did the one on Maijishan. I think they appeared in 1960s. I think there's
That's right.
a brief record about the trip in Michael Sullivan's volume on Maichi-san by Anil De Silva. And I think those are very important volumes. The pictures are really, really very good. So Professor Wangkungwu, do you have a comment or question? If so, you can turn up. Yeah.
Well, let me say how happy I am to have this chance to hear you, Romila, on a historic period that we actually lived through. But when you described the lack of Indian records about their travels around China and elsewhere, I was thinking that at that time it is true when the Chinese were sending their monks and their pilgrims to India to study India. They actually have very, very purposeful. They therefore kept very detailed records of what they wanted to know. So that was probably not true of the Indians. They were not writing anything back for people back in India they wanted to know. So that's one point to make. The second is to ask that when you were there, did you have the impression that there were any Chinese really interested in India? Because my impression is that when I was as a student earlier on in 47, 48, I never met any Chinese student who was interested in India or knew anything about it, even though we were excited, as you say, with this Asianism. That was pretty abstract. We talked about, as I said, general idealistic sort of thing. But I never actually, people like Qi Xianling, for example, I didn't meet him till much, much later, and he was studying in Europe, not so much in China. Yeah. And he didn't have an impact until later on. So I was curious to know, throughout that time, did you actually meet Chinese who were interested in India, who asked you about what was happening in India, for example?
Yeah, with the older generation, much older, the generation that I would have regarded as my teachers, 60 plus, there were 3 or 4 Chinese scholars who really were very, very learned and scholarly about things Indian, in the same way as we had 3 or 4 Indian scholars who knew a great deal about China and Southeast Asia and so on. But the older generation. The problem was that the younger generation, the younger scholars of my age, for example, I didn't find anybody who really was genuinely interested in knowing about what I was doing, what I was researching. The questions always came from the 60 plus people who had done some study of India, never from the people of my own age. And it's been the same thing here, that you've got maybe a couple of people now who would be competent in looking at Chinese sources, old, pre-modern, early historical Chinese sources. But the interest is all in contemporary studies, international relations, and that kind of thing. Your first question about, yes, the Chinese were motivated and came to India in order to learn about Buddhism from the sources. They took back manuscripts and so on. But you would think that there would be Indian philosophers, for example, who would say, well, what kind of philosophy are they doing in China? We have a smattering of, we know a little bit about the Yavanas and the kind of philosophy they do. But these Chinese monks who come here and stay here for years on end and collect manuscripts and study Sanskrit and the language of the manuscripts and so on, what kind of philosophy do they have? And you would think that somewhere along the line, some Indian philosopher would write something about Confucianism and dismiss it or praise it or have an attitude towards what's going on in this obviously important culture. But the absence of it is something that I simply cannot understand.
Professor Wang, Professor Thapar actually talks about... Professor Thapar actually talks about Xianai, who received them, and Xiangda, whom they could not meet because of the anti-rightist thing. But Qi Xianlin is mentioned, Professor Thapar. Qi Xianlin was at Peta, and he appears in Professor Thapar's diary as well.
In terms of the general awareness that people had about India at the time, You talk often about being serenaded by people singing to you Avarahu, which is something that
yes, that was a great.
All of us Indians in China have experienced. When I was living here in the early 2000s with my mother, I still was experiencing that.
No, it was absolutely incredible because, of course, it was the kind of film that was encouraged by the government because the social message was one that appealed to them. But that apart, it was a very popular film. And the joke, of course, was that the moment you went to a new town, you arrive at Xi'an and you check into your little hotel or wherever you're being put up, and you go out into the street and they all look at you and wonder who you are and so on. And then someone says, Indu, with a question mark, and then they start singing the tune of Avarahu. And the moment you smile and sing with them, they know, of course, that you're Indian. And this was the kind of introduction or whatever you choose to call it. It was the tune of Avarahu.
Yeah.
It was really.
Arnav, you want to ask the next question? And
Just
then we
a
have
short follow-up question, because about the
Sorry,
time
go
when
ahead,
Tansen's father went to China, I also remember quite a few young Indians were being sent to China to study Chinese, and so in the 50s. But I don't remember the Chinese sending Chinese students to India to study until much later. So that's another side of it. Whether you ever heard of any Chinese students going to India to study India, and did you meet anybody curious about it?
Yeah, not very many in that time, not very many in the 50s and 60s. I mean, we had, for example, when the Jawaharlal Nehru University was set up, and we had Chinese studies there, and there's now quite a bit that is done on China as part of one or two of the schools, School of Languages, as well as the School of International Relations and so on. You had one or two Chinese students coming in, yes. And we had some Indian students going to Beijing and other places to study Chinese. In fact, I had a very interesting experience, which I think I relate in the diary, that no, I don't. But this was on a later visit when I went to China after the collapse of the Cultural Revolution, when the Chinese were very anxious to catch up with what had been going on in the world in 20 years. And they thought of themselves as being somehow out of touch with new knowledge. They had this brilliant idea in Beijing University that they would invite specialists in different fields to come and give lectures for about 2 months. On the new developments that had taken place in the subject. And I remember I was asked to come in and talk about new developments in the study of early Indian history. And I did that. I went there and I gave lectures, and we had some of our JNU students who were studying Chinese also there who came to the lectures. And I remember one of them came to me and said, you know, the translation of your lectures is a little faulty. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said that, you know, when you talk about dissent and protest and ways of dissenting and protesting in ancient times, they translate it as class conflict, which is a different dimension altogether, you see. And I then realized that we have a long way to go towards understanding the nuances of languages on all sides, both on the Chinese side and possibly on our side as well. To understand that translation is not just something direct. You have to catch the ambience and the nuance of the word that is being used and the concept.
So Professor Wang, Arunav has actually written about a Chinese student who got a PhD from India.
Sorry?
Arunav, who is going to ask you the next question, Professor Thapar actually wrote about a Chinese student who studied in India and got a PhD. Arunav, you want to start by telling us about that person?
Sure. So I think the broader point that both Professor Wang and Professor Thapar have made, I think, still stands. But in some of the work that I've been doing along with people like Tansen and Adhira, I think we are discovering interesting points of contact and interesting at sort of in very specialized areas, so not sort of purely cultural exchange. So the work that Tansen is referring to deals with a very specialized subject, paleobotany, so the study of fossilized plants. And it turns out, from what I can, my estimate is that this is the first Chinese scientist to get a PhD from an Indian institution, and this is as early as 1946. So there are interesting sort of stories emerging now.
But that is explained by the fact that there is this very highly specialized expertise that is available in an Indian institution. So people from outside will come and get that expertise. But I'm talking about the general flow of how, you know, students go from here, from India to Australia, or India to somewhere else, Italy or France, and do PhDs. That kind of traffic hasn't started as yet.
So actually, when my father went, this was after the Panchsheel Treaty, and there was this exchange between Indian and Chinese students that happened. And my father was from the Indian side, the first Indian student to go to Beijing. And there were supposed to be 2 Chinese students who were supposed to go to India. But that did not happen until 2 years later. But that was the official exchange of students that started after 1954 with the Panchsheel Treaty. So there were supposed to be Chinese students going to India. We have not followed up on that, but the student exchange started from 54.
No, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there are students coming across. One just doesn't see them around. One is not aware of their presence, as one should be, because we were aware of their presence earlier.
Arnav, you want to go on?
Should I ask my question? Okay. Well, I just want to echo how much I've enjoyed this conversation, and also actually how much I've enjoyed reading the book. And I think I showed you earlier how many pages I have noted for this, of all sorts of interesting things. Many of them have already come up. I just wanted to highlight 2 things, or reinforce 2 things that you spoke about that I think are they were personally very appealing to me, and then ask a question that hasn't come up, sort of an area that has not been discussed. So first of all, I totally echo Adhira's enthusiasm for your enthusiasm for eating and enjoying the culinary sort of culture that I guess it's true wherever you go, but in this case, in the Chinese context. But there is a part of that was really striking. I think you mentioned this towards the end of the book, that you began to notice that all of this dining took place in public places, so restaurants or a banquet being arranged. And it was only, I think, one instance where you were invited home. So that is, I think, which sort of, I think, rings true for experiences even into the present, that it's rarer to be invited home still. So, but anyway, the food, as someone who enjoys food myself, I really appreciated your engagement with Chinese food.
But if I can make a comment on this point, you know, the question I kept asking myself was that, is it a tradition that you only entertain in a public place when you're serving food? Or is it that given the conditions of the revolution and change, that they felt they couldn't invite people to their homes because their homes were so simple? And therefore, you know, the impression conveyed would be the negative impression, which they didn't wish to have conveyed. That may have been another reason.
Yeah, I think that's certainly quite plausible in terms of, especially if, you know, looking at sort of academics and people that you're interacting with, sort of you know, what they would have been able to do. The second thing I wanted to note is you know, how well your book pairs with Vikram Seth's from Heaven Lake, which is a similar kind of sort of exploration into not just urban China, but you know, going into the countryside about 24 years down the road. So I'm already thinking, if I were to teach a class broadly on China, India, how we could do 1 week where we would read both, I think, very productively. So,
I see.
So it was really
that's interesting. I mean, now that you mention it, I read that book when it came out, but I didn't read it since. So maybe I should read it now and see how differently it
I think you might enjoy it too, given that your memory has been refreshed so much, you know, in the process of publishing this book. But so the question I wanted to ask, though, is has to do with, you know, there are instances across the book where you speak of encountering other foreigners. Of course, most notably Soviet foreigners, from, people from the Soviet Union, because of the, the close ties that the Chinese had with the Soviet Union at that time. But I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit more about what your sense of that was, the Sino-Soviet kind of relationship in 57, but more broadly, the other kinds of non-Chinese you encountered, and what that experience was like.
Yeah, well, one didn't encounter too many non-Chinese. There were very few in number. I suppose partly because most of the non-Chinese came on specialized jobs and went to other kinds of places. They wouldn't be chasing Buddhist sites and that kind of thing. The Soviets one met much more because they were in construction work as well. Apart from planning in Beijing and so on, a lot of them were on construction sites in farms, collective farms and that kind of thing. So they were giving advice. My reaction was one of aesthetics, in the sense that I thought to myself, ooh, I hope they don't pick up the Soviet aesthetic because the Chinese aesthetic is so much more superior. That kind of bothered me a little bit. And I also resented the fact that the Soviets had a superior air to them. They were very conscious, especially the families of the Soviet technicians who would come. They were very conscious of being somehow the better people. We've done it all. We know what it's all about. And you guys have to simply follow what we are telling you. There was an element of that. I mean, it wasn't openly so, but one kind of felt it in a curious kind of way. I may be exaggerating. It may have been just my reaction. But I was slightly resentful of this concession that was constantly being made to the Soviets being, the great people who are going to teach us how to enter the revolution and build a new society. And coming especially after 56, and what one had heard of the Khrushchev thing the year before, the resentment was even greater, because I kept saying to myself, I hope to God that you won't go that way.
Right.
I think Joanna wants a question, and then Professor Thapar, your two students have questions for you. Joanna?
Thank you, Tansen. Professor Thapar, you talk quite a bit in the book about your interactions with, or your observations with Chinese women. And I'm wondering whether you can say a little bit more about your direct interactions with people. For me, when I got to go to China about 15 years later, that was one of the most interesting parts of my experience. Of course, we went to a lot of factories and scenic sites and so on and so forth, but just interacting with people, especially women, was particularly interesting.
Well, let me begin by saying that there was a lot of interest in us as professional women, photographer, an art historian, a historian, and so on. And women would come up and question us and say, but none of you are married? Why are you doing this kind of work? What is it that it's leading to? And so on. As far as the Chinese women were concerned, there were two kinds of people whom we met. The majority were, yes, very liberated and free, and moved around in a way in which, one didn't think was any way strange. But there was always a little reminder. There was always somebody that walked awkwardly, and you realize that her feet had been bound. That element of the past would suddenly creep in and kind of remind you that there are still things that have to be put right in the society. It isn't a society that has arrived. It is in the process of getting there, as it were. And otherwise, on the whole, I must say that I think we had a very comfortable time with Chinese women.
I remember something similar in that sometimes we would take photographs of groups of elderly women with tiny feet sitting together, and they would always say, please don't take pictures of us, we're not representative of the new China.
Yeah. yeah, there was that awareness. Yes.
That note about photographs, there was a question on the Q&A about if you have photographs. Yes, your book has a number of very, very interesting photographs. So the person who was asking this question, Wang Yichou, I would recommend her to look at the book and see the photographs that Professor Thapar has included in the travelogue. These are really fascinating and very valuable photographs as well. But Sumati, who was your student, I think, from the undergraduate days, and Liu Xinru have questions. So Sumati, you want to go first?
Romila, first of all, so wonderful to see you.
Oh, it's lovely to see you too.
2 or 3 years now. And I do echo Professor Meyer's comment. I've known you for 40 years and you remain evergreen in my opinion.
No, come on.
I'm really delighted, especially in these pandemic times. And I've so enjoyed the conversation so much. And it's brought back such good memories of such fantastic conversations we've had over the years, but also your scholarship over the years. My goodness. I wanted to actually ask you if you could reflect on the role of serendipity and chance. I was so taken in the early part of your comments about how you got a chance to do this, right? And it was completely serendipitous. You were in London, you got this chance phone call from Anil. You walked into Professor Basham's office and he said, of course you have to do this. And I kept thinking, if something like this were to happen today, if a student of mine came and said, to me, I have this opportunity to go off somewhere, can I drop my dissertation and take off? I would pause and hesitate because, we're all so much routinized now, and the pressure of time, of getting the students through the pipeline and all of this. So the texture of scholarship, the texture of pursuing an intuition, taking risks, all of that, it seems to me, has been eroded, right? I wondered whether you could comment on that with, all these wonderful years of experience you have.
Well, it's something that I have been thinking about a lot lately because I'm going to turn 90 next year. And I have been sitting and saying to myself, you've been churning out academic stuff all your life. Isn't it time for you to throw it all aside and just sit down and do nothing or think about nothing, write about nothing, write any way you like, anything you wish to do. Give yourself the luxury of saying, what do I really want to do? Let me just do it. The trouble is that, of course, you never know what you really want to do, because every time you think you want to do this, then something else comes along and you say, oh, yes, fine, I'd like to do that as well, kind of thing. But no, I think you're very right that a lot has been lost because of the pressure. I'm very, very concerned about the pressure because I think that destroys a certain quality of life where you can afford to sit back and say, I'll just look on and see what it does to me. Now, it's become such a luxury now. Only if you're, secure in a job can you do that. And even then you can't because you're competing all the time. And I find it very difficult. From the moment I sit down in front of a computer, I find the technology strange because I'm still writing with a pencil on a piece of paper. And I feel that much more comfortable. And my thoughts flow much more easily on that than on a computer. But that's a very personal thing. But yes, I think that the whole pressure element is extremely strong. Made stronger by the fact, of course, that some people like us who've been attacked and abused viciously all our lives by a certain coterie of people, you may take the decision, as I did very early on, that this is water off a duck's back and it doesn't matter. I'm paying no attention to it. And you can block it on your computer too, quite happily. Nevertheless, it remains. It remains in simple things like you go somewhere and you're introduced to someone and they say, oh, so you're the controversial historian or you're the anti-national historian kind of thing, you see, and you immediately realize that It's not just the pressure of the job. The other disaster, I think, is social media. It's become a very immense pressure on social life. What you say, what you do, the kind of person you are, you're constantly under watch. You may turn around and say you like it. And I'm quite sure that people that are active on social media are perfectly normal people who like it, who like to be active and talk about themselves. But the question that has to be always asked is, am I really all that fond of myself that I'm wanting to display myself on social media? And what is the effect of what other people are saying? I mean, we all grew up with mother and father saying you can do this and you can't do that and so on. And some of us resented it and some of us took it in our stride and went on with it. But today you've got the entire world through this system commenting on what you're doing. That's not a very pleasant way to spend one's life. And I'm afraid I'm terribly old-fashioned in this.
Thank you, Sumati. And Liu Xinru, if you want to turn on your video and ask a question. You are on mute. Maybe Adhira, you can ask the questions on the text.
Yeah, I'll bring in a question that's from Professor Julia Lovell, and she asks, recalling your discussions with Chinese archaeologists in the 50s, how important and conspicuous in their research or approach were the frameworks of interpretation and sequencing from Marxism, Leninism?
Well, I think I'm the wrong person to ask because I haven't kept up with that. I have not read on Chinese archaeology for 4 decades now, almost since then. When I was there, that was one of the things that I was a little unhappy with, and that was that there was a tendency to describe a certain excavation or a certain situation and then immediately come in with a Marxist phraseology to explain it or something. And one felt like saying, wait a minute, why don't you sort out what you're describing first in greater detail and understand it before you bring in the phraseology? Does every excavation of the second millennium have to be called feudal? Maybe not. I mean, one is interested now in what people might be thinking because the whole debate on feudalism is huge in Europe and elsewhere, where people are questioning the very concept of feudalism. But there are other debates which are also extremely interesting that are using the concept of feudalism. But my point is that one can't rush to provide a label for an excavation or a site or whatever it is without fully understanding its context. And I had a feeling that that was the kind of thing that might have been happening in the 50s. But I imagine by now it's probably very different. And I'm sure that people are much more, intellectually sensitive to what they are describing.
I mean, more appropriately here, maybe the last question is from Liu Xinru, your student, and also my mentor at University of Pennsylvania. Really nice to see you.
I know we only have a little bit time. I want just to say something about the current Chinese scholars interested in India. In the last few years, also thanks to the pandemic, I could use Zoom to direct some students in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in the Institute of World History. We actually recruit, we noticed there are some young Chinese people very interested in early history, especially Indian history. So I've been teaching courses And now I am directing a student, master students to do a summary of current scholarship of early Indian history in India. Because they try to search online, there are very little scholarship, internationally outside India on Indian history. So I said, you should direct your site to India, because in India, people are still doing their history. Don't look at America, don't look at just Germany or England, look at India. And so she's doing that. I will tell her about this. Another thing is about the Chinese archaeology. I do have contact with them. And because it's a newly discovered lot of different archaeological sites. And they start to realize the diversity of our ancestors. So that is something parallel in the Indian, early Indian historiography. Look at the country not as single origin, but a more larger scale. So I think that's a development, we may want to pay attention. And they are going to have a kind of forum to have to introduce different parts of Chinese archaeology, not only in the Yangshao, Longshan, but more, new discovered sites to look at this. So my suggestion is, Tencent, you may want to make contact with those people.
Yeah, we are actually doing a workshop at PETA early November on China-India's method to the recent master's students. So we have been doing it with the Chinese students as well, because you're absolutely right. There is a lack of interactions with Indian scholars and scholars outside in China. And then we have been trying to do that. I don't know if you know about Chen Guangxian, who has promoted this idea about India as method. I don't know if Professor Thapar has read about that. So he has been encouraging the Chinese scholars to do exactly what Professor Liu was saying, not to go to the West, but to look at India as a model to study China. And I think there's much to be done with that in the Indian side as well, looking at China as perhaps a method. And so I think this is where I think Adhira would have a final question about the takeaway from your book. So Adhira, you want to ask our final question?
Yeah, just to round out our conversation, which was so insightful and enjoyable. Given our current political climates that we're inhabiting in both China and India, what do you hope readers reading it today can take away from the book? And you'll hint a little bit at this at the end of your epilogue. I think there is, although you frame the book as a kind of picture of a certain time, I think it does hold contemporary relevance. How do you see it interacting with what readers would bring to it today and what they can take out of it?
That's actually a very big question, because in a sense, what one is discussing is, how does one see the future? And I don't know that any of us can really actually delineate what the future is going to be like. But my position on this is that maybe this is simply my line of hope, my line of optimism, which one has to have if one is going to survive. I mean, things are so grim all around the world that it's becoming more and more difficult to be optimistic, but one has to be optimistic. I think that major changes take place, but they do themselves undergo change in 30 to 40 years. I mean, the great revolutions that have taken place all over the world have undergone change in that kind of time period. couple of generations, and they're different. The question is, how do they change society in the process in which they're doing so? Revolutions become authoritarian. Authoritarianism is something that inevitably damages all societies. And therefore, what is the damage and how is the damage to be repaired? But I think that the more we focus on what we want from the future, that is terribly important. It's not so much a case of, all right, we may have a very difficult present and we may not know how to get out of this, but we still have to go on presenting ideas about what it is we eventually want and holding that out as this is the future that we're working towards. And in that sense, I mean, what I'm trying to say in the epilogue and in the final paragraph is that, yes, the situation does look very difficult at the moment, but the time may come when we will work with each other because we will need each other. And let's see what the future holds. But I would like to be optimistic, let me put it that way. Whether it's a sensible thing or not, I don't know, but I would like to be optimistic.
That's a very good note to end with, and I'm optimistic that you'll be able to come to China very soon.
Well, I don't know about that.
but the other thing is, of course, I think the book should be an inspiration to some of the students in India to study China. The three of us here, Adhira, Arunab, and I, are based outside India, but I think I hope the book will instigate students in India to look at China from the 1950s point of view, and study China. So I hope that the book will serve that purpose. And that was the reason I wrote the review in the Indian Express that was meant especially for the Indian audience to really study places that we have not been working on in India, Majisan and Dunhuang, unfortunately. But so hopefully the book will be an inspiration to students working on China, not just the IR border issues, but these kinds of very, very fascinating things that you have in your book.
Thank you. I hope so. I hope so too.
Thank you. With that note, I would like to really thank you for staying with us for over 1 hour and a half. To Joanna and others who joined us, especially Professor Wang Kungwu and Liu Shenru, coming and meeting with Professor Thapar, and all the members in the audience who interacted with us. And then we hope that you'll read Professor Thapar's book, enjoy not only what she has written, but also the photographs she has in the book. And then we can have another discussion perhaps next year at some point when Professor Thapar is in China. So thank you so much. Good evening.
Thank you.
Good night,
Thank you
Professor
also from my side.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a marvelous evening for me. Lovely to meet you all.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.